Hey, what's up, guys? My name is Doug, and today we're going to be going over the facts of the case. We're going to read the criminal complaint and the charging paperwork on Derek Chauvin and the other three officers. So we're going to go over the facts today. The reason for this video is so that we can all have the facts. Now we're going to see what they have against the officers and what was actually filed officially with the courts. This will be essentially the probable cause to arrest, which would have been signed by a judge, essentially like a warrant. And this will show why they were able to arrest Derek Chauvin and the other officers. Today, I want to talk about facts. Opinions will change, circumstances will change, things will come up in this trial and in this case. But the things that will not change are the facts. There will be just more and more facts added to the case. That's how these cases work. Facts almost never are taken away from a case, because once a fact has been established, that doesn't get taken away. More facts will be added to the case as they gather more information during their investigation. The facts will not change. So those of you who are interested in the case against Derek Chauvin, this is the video for you. We want to talk about the facts that we know. Okay, since the last video that I made, 3 more former Minneapolis police officers were charged. This is 5 days after Derek Chauvin's charges. We know that Derek Chauvin had his knee on Floyd's neck. That's a fact. We saw that in the video. It was more than 8 minutes because we have that on video. We know that on Friday he was charged with manslaughter and murder in the 3rd degree. I remember talking about the issue was intent. It's almost impossible to charge a police officer with intent in cases like this because he was responding to a call. It's hard to get that intent element of the crime to be proven. So when they arrested him on what they had, which was not having intent, but having a careless disregard, a blatant disregard for one's life, that being George Floyd. But there's been new charges now. Now the other officers are arrested, and they upgraded the charges from 3rd degree murder to 2nd degree murder. The Attorney General insisted that the public opinion and the public pressure was not a factor in the arrests of these officers and in the decision to elevate the charge against Derek Chauvin. That's what he says. But in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, they could not prove, they did not have the facts to support premeditation on the murder, which is what you need for 1st degree. But in 2nd degree, you need Derek Chauvin to commit a felony assault. His intent to commit a felony assault, which resulted in the death of another human being. And that's what we have. So it's unintentional, but it is him committing a felony assault. So it's essentially Derek Chauvin had the intention on committing a felony assault. So he intended on depriving George Floyd of oxygen and cutting off the blood flow to his brain. That would be the felony assault. And then that unintentionally resulted in the death of George Floyd. That's why they upgraded the charges. So they didn't have proof or evidence that he intended to kill him, so they arrested him on the 3rd degree murder. But they feel like they have established now that he had intended on hurting him and committing a felony assault. So since he intended on committing an assault on George Floyd and it resulted in George Floyd's death, that is the elements that they need to upgrade the charges to 2nd degree murder. I'm assuming that the changes in the additional elements that they were able to pick up these last few days had to do with the statements that the other officers made, specifically Officer Lane. In the charging documents, it says that Officer Lane asked, should we roll him on his side? Where Chauvin then replied to him saying, no, staying put where we got him. I'm worried about excited delirium or whatever, Lane said. And that's why we have him on his stomach, Chauvin responded, according to the complaint. So, this is the things I was talking about when I said that we will get added information during the investigation. On the last video I wrote, which I'll leave a link to right here, it said that unless we have video or audio or a statement from them saying that one of them knew that he was in excited delirium and that he should roll him over on his side, or saying that, no, we're not going to roll him on his side, or saying something like, I want to kill him, or saying something like, no, I don't care, or whatever. Those are important facts. Those are important pieces of evidence in the case. So my assumption is statements were made and statements were reported, probably in the use of force reports that the officers had filled out, which is interesting when you think about. So initially, when this incident happened, remember, the officers weren't fired yet. They weren't fired till the next day when the video surfaced and it went viral. When an incident like this happens, officers turn in their reports. They don't go home. They typically will, even if their shift is over, they'll pull overtime until they finish typing their reports, especially on felonies and use of force and stuff like that, because the detectives only have so much time to charge cases. So the patrol officers will then have to stay and type their reports. Well, in this case, what I'm assuming is, and this is not a fact, I'm assuming based on what I know, my experience as a police officer, that the officers then went in and typed their reports. And when the officers were fired the next day, and then Derek Chauvin was arrested 4 days later, and then 3 days after that, these officers arrested. So sometime between then, someone made a statement saying that Officer Lane said, "Shouldn't we roll him on his side? I'm worried about excited delirium." Which my training taught me that with excited delirium, there's things that you cannot do as far as use of force goes, because you're worried about them dying. Excited delirium is when the heart is racing, the breathing is heavy, they're super strong, they can't focus, they're breathing real heavy, you can't get them to calm down. It's literally their body is going into, it's overheating, they're super hot, and it's going into overdrive. That's excited delirium. And when that happens, you can't do certain things like tase somebody. Just because the state that the heart is in makes it delicate. And if you were to tase a normal person, it wouldn't have any problems, but tasing somebody who is in excited delirium could kill them. So we're trained that we can't tase people who are in excited delirium. And why would you tase someone in excited delirium? Because oftentimes people, when they're in excited delirium, if we're on scene, it's because they've committed a crime. So usually if somebody, like in the case, one of the cases that I had, the guy was on somebody's roof and he was telling them that he needed to hide in the house, and they were telling him to leave and he wouldn't leave, and they were freaked out. So I showed up at the scene and he was on the roof and he was jumping from roof to roof and talking crazy and running and screaming, and you could tell that he was out of his mind, and he was breathing heavy and he was sweating profusely and his mind was racing and he was saying crazy stuff. If they go to commit a crime, break in somebody's house, and you're on scene, or they have some type of a weapon, or they're resisting your arrest, if you feel like you're in danger and you have met the criteria for tasing them to gain compliance, if they have excited delirium, you can't do it out of risk for their life. So the fact that Officer Lane stated, "I'm worried about excited delirium, should we roll him on his side?" And then Derek Chauvin said, "No, we're staying put where we got him. That's why we have him on his stomach," Chauvin stated. If you've ever tried to breathe on your stomach with your face to the ground, especially with somebody on your back or on your neck, you can't breathe. On your side is probably better. So Officer Lane had a better idea of what he should do. Typically you want him to sit up so that they can breathe and the blood isn't in their head and they have all this weight on their back. I know there was something about the car. He didn't want to get in the car. He was claustrophobic or something. In any case, he had a chance. Derek Chauvin had a chance to get off of him and to put him in a better position so that he wouldn't die, and he didn't. So I'm assuming this is new information. But it said that several minutes later, Kang checked Floyd's wrist for a pulse and said, "I can't find a pulse." So that means Kang knows at this point that the guy doesn't have a pulse. Okay, so the other thing that we know is that the official autopsy from the Hennepin County Medical Examiner stated that Floyd's cause of death as a cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression, which means that he basically died of a heart attack, cardiac arrest, and it says complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. So it does say neck compression here in the cause of death. It does say cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual. Essentially, he was in excited delirium. He had a heart attack because he had people sitting on him and on his neck, and then he was fighting it. So his blood was pumping, he's sweating, he's breathing heavy. It did say that there were significant underlying conditions to his death. The medical examiner says that the death was by homicide, but that he had significant underlying conditions, including hypertensive heart disease, fentanyl intoxication, and recent methamphetamine use. That's going to complicate things for the case because he didn't die of asphyxiation. He did have hypertensive heart disease and fentanyl intoxication and meth use. That's going to take a little bit of the bite or the edge off of the case. I still think that they will probably be convicted, but it's going to make it harder and it's going to complicate some things. So the other thing that we have here is that there was a private examination funded by the Floyd family that reached an altogether different conclusion. It found that police officers pressing on his neck and body cut blood and airflow to his brain, causing him to die by mechanical asphyxia. The autopsy paid for by the family also found that Floyd had no other medical conditions that contributed to his death. That seems unfortunate to me, because now it's going to be, because those are so completely different, those two reports, it's going to seem like somebody was lying. I don't see why it's an issue, but people need to understand the medical examiner, it does not work for the police department. Like, they're completely different. And the medical examiner has a job to do, and he wants to do his job well. He doesn't have anyone to serve. They're not buddies. It's not like he hangs out with cops and that kind of stuff. That's not how that works. He's his own person. He has his own job in his own department. So I highly doubt that he fudged the reports, right? Especially when something like this that's so vocal and it's so out in the open and in the public. So the fact that the one that was paid for by the family found that he had no other medical conditions that contributed to his death and that he died from asphyxiation, mechanical asphyxiation. Since it's so different, there's such a variant, that seems like that's going to cause some problems. If they were closer in diagnosis, I feel like they could both be used by the prosecution. But now one's going to be used for the defense, one's going to be used for the prosecution. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, except for if one of them gets thrown out or determined as false, then that's a huge part of the case that doesn't get used by the prosecutors. All right, so something that's new to the case based on the medical examiner's findings is that he did mention pressure on the back. Because pressure on the back is mentioned, compressing Mr. Floyd's lungs, that's why those other officers were charged. So now you have guys at the back of George Floyd who are not Derek Chauvin on the neck. Now the back is coming into play. That's why these guys are now arrested. They needed the medical examiner to do that. So everyone that's freaking out about why didn't they arrest those guys sooner, because you need facts. That's how the law works, right? And you need probable cause to arrest. The moment you violate the probable cause, even if it's because the city wants you to or all the public wants you to, you have now put in jeopardy the case. So a year from now, when they're in trial, based on fruit of the poisonous tree, if something in that case was done wrong, that arrest was done wrong or premature, or you didn't have the facts yet, everything else gets thrown out. And that's when you have hung juries, or that's when you have him getting let off. So the prosecutors are trying to do what they're supposed to do. Their job is to prosecute these cases. They want to prosecute them, just like the public does. But they want to win. So they can't jump the gun. They have to be patient. In cases like this, people need to have some patience with the prosecuting attorneys, because they literally need certain things to happen, or this case will become garbage and you will get let off on technicalities. I've seen it hundreds of times. Okay, so I want to show the timeline of how we got from third-degree murder to second-degree murder. So remember, initially when Derek Chauvin was arrested, he was arrested on third-degree murder charge because it doesn't require intent. Everybody freaked out and lost their mind saying, no, we need to get him on first-degree murder. This is a first-degree murder charge. Why didn't you go with first-degree murder? But you have to realize something. The prosecutors want to charge this case. And the higher the case, the better they look. They want what you want. The problem is they can't work on feelings. They can't work on what it looked like on a video. Believe it or not, that doesn't work. Not in a court of law. And if they screw up now, this early in the case, based on what we call fruit of the poisonous tree, if something in this case gets thrown out this early, everything that resulted from that initial action will also get thrown out. You can crumble a case with mistakes this early in a case. So everybody needs to have some patience. The prosecutors want to convict him, so they want to convict him for the highest offense they can. That actually makes them look better, but they have to do it right. So that's why it took a few days to arrest Derek Chauvin, and that's why they did it for third degree. It's actually harder to upgrade a case than it is to downgrade a case. They did it the right way, if you ask me. They had what they had to get an arrest, which was 3rd degree. But they needed the coroner medical examiner's report. That was huge. And the moment they got it, he gets upgraded to 2nd degree and the other officers are charged. Here's why. Initially, they did not have proof of intent or enough evidence to show intent on killing George Floyd. And they had nothing about the back compression having an effect on the death of George Floyd. So, since the death was ruled a homicide based on compression to the neck and chest by the medical examiner, they had more, so they could include those other officers that everyone was upset about. That's why they now got arrested. And they upgraded the 3rd degree murder to 2nd degree murder. The only way that I see them being able to get that is that someone made a statement. If they have statements from the officers, especially corroborating statements, or from Derek Chauvin, which I think is possible. The reason why I say that is because, remember, he wasn't arrested until a few days later. He wasn't fired until the next day after the George Floyd incident. So my assumption is after the incident happened, they went back to the report writing room and they typed their reports. So they have statements now of what they did, and they have reports that they wrote. Well, when those reports came out and the prosecutors were able to look at what the report said, and then the death certificate showed a homicide was the cause of death by the medical examiner, now they had a little bit more here. In the probable cause statement, it said that the autopsy revealed no physical findings that support a diagnosis of traumatic asphyxia or strangulation. It cited that Mr. Floyd had coronary artery disease and hypertensive heart disease. The combined effects of Mr. Floyd being restrained by the police, his underlying health conditions, and any potential intoxicants in his system likely contributed to his death. So this one complicates it, okay? The fact that you have the medical examiner saying that it wasn't just him getting choked or having a knee on his neck, but that he had heart disease, essentially, and the fact that he was in excited delirium with complications due to methamphetamine use and the drugs that he had in his system. That's going to complicate things for the prosecutors. So remember, initially the count was murder in the 3rd degree, which is perpetrating imminently dangerous act and evincing depraved mind. Then he also had manslaughter in the 2nd degree, which is culpable negligence creating unreasonable risk. The reason that they do that is because in some states, not in Hawaii, so we didn't have this, but in some states you're able to charge the greater charge and a lesser charge to give the jury a chance. If you don't meet the criteria in court for that higher offense, they can still say, yeah, well, it met the lesser offense, the manslaughter charge. So I see why they did that here. Here's what the criminal complaint says. These are the facts that we have right now. It says that on May 25th, 2020, someone called 911 and reported that a man bought merchandise from the Cup Foods at 3759 Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis, Hennepin County, Minnesota, with a counterfeit $20 bill. So it's a counterfeit bill case. And at 8:08 p.m., Minneapolis Police Department officers Thomas Lane, J.A. Kang arrived with their body cameras, activated and running. The officers learned from store personnel that the man who passed the counterfeit 20 was parked in a car around the corner from the store on 38th Street. The body-worn camera video obtained by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension shows that the officers approached the car, Lane on the driver's side and Kang on the passenger side. 3 people were in the car. George Floyd was in the driver's seat, and a known adult male was in the passenger seat, and a known adult female was sitting in the back seat. As Officer Lane began speaking with Mr. Floyd, he pulled his gun out and pointed at Mr. Floyd's open window and directed Mr. Floyd to show his hands. When Mr. Floyd put his hands on the steering wheel, Lane put his gun back in his holster. I don't know why he drew his weapon at this point, unless he had some information from the store owner or somebody else that there was a weapon involved. I don't know what happened there. When Officer Kang was speaking with the front seat passenger, Officer Lane ordered Mr. Floyd out of the car, put his hands on Mr. Floyd, and pulled him out of the car. Officer Lane handcuffed Mr. Floyd. Mr. Floyd actively resisted being handcuffed. So the first time he resisted was when he was getting handcuffed by Officer Lane. All right, so once Mr. Floyd was handcuffed, it said that he became compliant and walked with Officer Lane to the sidewalk and sat on the ground at Officer Lane's direction. So in less than 2 minutes, Officer Lang asked Mr. Floyd for his name and ID and asked him if he was on anything and explained that he was arresting him for passing that counterfeit money. That's when Officer Kang and Lang stood Mr. Floyd up and attempted to walk him to their squad car. This is only 6 minutes later, so we're talking 8:14 p.m. Mr. Floyd stiffened up, fell to the ground, and told the officers he was claustrophobic. That's when Derek Chauvin and another officer, Tau Toa, then arrived in a separate squad car. He fell to the ground stiff and told him he was claustrophobic, essentially saying, I'm not getting in the car. He was already handcuffed. So when Derek Chauvin shows up on the scene, it's not his scene. There's other officers that were the initial officers. That's what we call them. He shows up as a backup officer. It's not his scene. Mr. Floyd is already in handcuffs. It says here that the officers made several attempts to get Mr. Floyd into the squad car from the driver's side, but he would not voluntarily get in the car and struggle with the officers by intentionally falling down, saying he was not going in the car and refusing to stand still. While he was standing outside the car, Mr. Floyd said and began repeating that he couldn't breathe. The defendant went to the passenger side and tried to get Mr. Floyd into the car from that side, and Lang and Kang assisted. So it says here that Derek Chauvin went to the passenger side and tried to get Mr. Floyd into the car from that side, and he was assisted by Lang and Kang. So at this point, they're trying to get him in the car. But it said that Derek Chauvin pulled Mr. Floyd out of the passenger side of the squad car, and Mr. Floyd went to the ground face down, still handcuffed. So he tried to get him in, but it was hard. They couldn't get him in. It was at that point that Derek Chauvin pulls him back out where he landed on the ground, face down, handcuffed. Kang held Mr. Floyd's back and Lane held his legs, where Derek Chauvin placed his left knee in the area of Mr. Floyd's head and neck. Mr. Floyd said, I cannot breathe, multiple times, and repeatedly said, Mama and please as well. The defendant and the other two officers stayed in their positions. The officers said, You're talking fine, Mr. Floyd, as he continued to move back and forth. Lane asked, should we roll him on his side? And that's when Derek Chauvin said, no, stay and put where we got him. I'm worried about excited delirium or whatever. But then Derek Chauvin said, that's why we have him on his stomach. None of the three officers moved from their positions. So that's where it gets complicated. So you have officers admitting that he's probably in excited delirium and that he shouldn't be on his belly with knees on his back. And that's when Derek Chauvin said, no, that's why he's on his stomach, which is obviously bad training. He either knew that he shouldn't have him on his stomach and wanted to kill him, or he didn't know because he hadn't done this and wasn't trained well enough. But the body-worn camera shows Mr. Floyd continue to move and breathe. But at 8:24, Mr. Floyd stopped moving. So at this point, we're going from 8:08 till 8:24. Earlier in this paperwork, it said that at 8:14, Floyd stiffened up and fell to the ground. So that means from 8:14 to 8:24. So you have 10 minutes before he stopped moving. At 8:25:31, the video appears to show Mr. Floyd cease to breathe or speak. Lane said, want to roll him on his side? And Kang checked Mr. Floyd's right wrist for a pulse and said, I can't find one. I couldn't find one. None of the officers moved from their positions. At 8:27 and 24 seconds, the defendant removed his knee from Mr. Floyd's neck. An ambulance and emergency medical personnel arrived, and the officers placed Mr. Floyd on a gurney, and the ambulance left the scene. Mr. Floyd was pronounced dead at the Hennepin County Medical Center. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner conducted Mr. Floyd's autopsy on May 26, 2020. The full report of the ME is pending, but the ME has made the following preliminary findings. The autopsy revealed no physical findings that supported diagnosis of traumatic asphyxia or strangulation. Mr. Floyd had underlying health conditions including coronary artery disease and hypertensive heart disease. The combined effects of Mr. Floyd being restrained by the police, his underlying health conditions, and any potential intoxicants in his system likely contributed to his death. The defendant had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in total. 2 minutes and 53 seconds of this was after Mr. Floyd was non-responsive. Police are trained that this type of restraint with a subject in a prone position is inherently dangerous. There you go. I mean, that's essentially the report in a nutshell. That's what they needed to issue this warrant. And then they went ahead and arrested him on $500,000 bail. So they think that he intended to assault him and that he died because of it. So we have a felony assault that resulted in the death of another human. That's second-degree felony murder in Minnesota. They know that they don't have the intent to go for first-degree murder because he responded to the scene and everything got super crazy. And according to the law, that's what you need. If they were to arrest him for first-degree murder and not have it, everything that they got after that first-degree murder charge is going to get thrown out in court. And then he goes free. So They had to go with what they had. And since the medical examiner had ruled that Floyd's death was a homicide, but that his heart and lungs stopped working while he was being restrained, they know that Derek Chauvin had an opportunity to roll him on his side and not put his knee on his neck anymore. And he chose not to, and he was asked by another officer. Now they have him knowing and being asked by other officers who are much newer than him, much fresher out of academy, that they should roll him over. They're worried about excited delirium. And he said, no, that's why we have him on his stomach. Which not only is not what you're taught, but that was his moment where he could have come out of this, and he didn't. So they're saying we have enough to show that he intended on assaulting him feloniously. And then he died as a result. And it says that Officer Thao watched the officers subduing Floyd and then became concerned that the gathering people who were filming and saying things could be a danger. So then he stood up and he stood between the officers and the crowd. That's why he wasn't helping. He's saying he was trying to address the crowd and potential traffic concerns. So Thao, Kang, and Lane each are facing aiding and abetting for second-degree manslaughter and for second-degree murder. Those carry 40 years and 10 years. So that's what they're facing for helping him kill George Floyd, essentially. So there you have it. Those are the facts in the case. That's what we have right now in the charging paperwork. Now you know why Derek Chauvin was arrested and why the other officers were arrested and what's happening legally to them and why it took the time that it took and the twists and turns of this case and where we're at. I hope that I brought some type of clarity to the situation. If you got any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section, and I'll make sure that I get to them. I will try to clarify and answer any questions that you guys may have. I appreciate you guys watching, and thanks a lot. Aloha.